Oh, yeah.
Oh, welcome all. I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and territories of the indigenous people of UBC, the Musqueam people. Today's talk will be, today's speaker is Karthik Akkiraju, who is a professor, a freshly minted professor in materials engineering. And his work is both multi and interdisciplinary. It's multidisciplinary in the sense that he actually runs a lab which has things like catalysis at the molecular level in materials engineering. And then his second aspect of his work is tied to using large data sets and computational social science to understand well-being. And the interdisciplinary or the synthesis is that his goal is to build better materials to improve human well-being as a whole. So that's Karthik's big vision and plan. But without much ado, Karthik, take over, please. Oh yeah, he got a PhD from MIT and was a postdoc at Yale for a couple of years.
Thanks, Milind, for the very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm super excited to be here and share some of my thoughts and some of our recent results in the area of quantifying the relationship between material consumption and happiness. So the broad question that drives my research program and the lab that I run is, how do we assess material sustainability? Before we get into the question, the word material itself is sort of tricky for me personally, because coming from a materials engineering background, this is specific things like lithium, copper, steel, or the alloys that come with putting these things together. But as you think about human development, material things are something very different. These are things that people consume: food, energy, housing, clothing, which we associate with material needs. So today, I'll broadly use the word material systems to encompass all these aspects. So this could be something very specific, as we'll see in some of the examples, but something as broad as food needs, right? So that is what I'll refer to as material systems. And in the lab that I run, we engineer these systems taking into consideration that the service they provide to humans and the environmental impact that they have. And we are a small lab, and our core principles are materials design and the intersection with well-being, environment, and policy. So the way we do this is what we call a demand-side framework. So demand-side framework is where you target specific behaviors, choices, lifestyles of people that lets them consume the way they're consuming, and identify lifestyles that can give you high well-being with low material consumption, right? So that's the overall goal of the framework. And this is sort of in contradiction or at odds with what we regularly associate with a supply side modeling. So if we broadly think about the three sustainable development goals around clean energy and climate action, what supply side solutions tell us to do is, we're going to assume that the demand that comes from households' lifestyles and the underlying patterns are going to remain the same, and the demand is going to start increasing into the future. And we change our supply sources of energy to meet that demand. So this could still be complete switch to renewables. It could be we continue our fossil fuel consumption but have carbon capture as a backup to that, or we go nuclear, right? So all of these would entail supply side solutions. And these solutions come with consequences. So they have, as you will see, a direct consequence on what our future material demand is going to look like, and which will be again correlated with the quality of our climate and environment. To give you a very specific example, here's looking at the copper demand for the next 30 years. So on the y-axis, you have the rate of copper that's been historically mined. So that's the red plot here. And then the x-axis is the time axis. If we continue the trend, we're going to end up somewhere here with about 37 million tons of copper being mined every year. And if we were to meet our goal of replacing all the existing gasoline cars with just EVs and hybrids, we need about 30% more production, which is a big gap, but seems doable. But if our ultimate goal is to hit net zero by 2050, we are looking at about 97 million tons of copper being extracted every year from now to 2050. So that's about 2.5 times additional production every year that needs to be made in order to meet that. And there is no way, given the recycling rates we have, the mining efficiency rates we are ever going to meet that. And this is the case for any other critical material as well. Cobalt, lithium, all of them have demands ranging anywhere from 500 to 1,000% increase if we are to meet our goals by 2050. So from a supply side engineering point of view, this would be very exciting. How do you develop more efficient mining practices? Can you do more mining exploration to reach this goal here? But from a demand side, we take a step back and first ask, what are the impacts that are going to be associated if you were to meet these goals? And more importantly, a lot of these materials are classified as critical materials. The question is, critical for whose needs? Whose demand are we meeting when we go for these newer explorations? So let's look at impacts first. So when it comes to impacts, we could broadly classify impacts as environmental impacts, so coming from emissions, and then social impacts, which are difficult to quantify. So these could be things like food insecurity associated with land use patterns, water scarcity, conflict. And our fossil fuel feedstocks sort of fall in between both of these. So they have massive environmental and social impacts. And it's only been very recently that we are able to capture some of these into our economic models. So for example, the social cost of carbon was first introduced in 2010, and Canada just adopted it in 2023. So the social cost of carbon is the economic damage that 1 metric ton of carbon would do to the environment. And numbers range anywhere from $200 to about $1,600. And you could use these in your macroeconomic models to model the damages of CO2 emissions. And more recently, people have come up with even more staggering numbers about the mortality cost of a ton of carbon, right? So to give you again sort of a rule of thumb, 3.5 times the consumption of an American lifestyle is equal to 1 life lost, right? So, and people in Canada are not that far away from this number. And this is just associated with fossil fuels, which we spent a lot of time characterizing and understanding the impacts. And with the new material economy, a lot of these impacts are going to get transferred to the specific critical materials. But the trick here is that a lot of these impacts are going to be highly localized. And we do not already have enough data to quantify the impacts associated with the extraction of these materials. And given the impact, the demand that we saw, all of these impacts are just going to get even worse as time goes on, right? So sort of put this in a nutshell, when we think about supply side, the climate and environment has a direct connection to well-being of those in extractive locations. And this is a direct conflict with the other 2 sustainable development goals of responsible production and good health and well-being for all. So this is where we came in and said, okay, there needs to be a better way to think about this. How do we dictate future materials demand that does not just assume that people are going to be consuming the way they've always been? So we started looking a little more deeply at the connection between household lifestyles and well-being. Right? So we wanted to identify lifestyles that will help you achieve a high level of well-being with low material consumption. and use that to drive and dictate what our future material demand is going to look like. And this is sort of the integrated framework for thinking about materials design. And people in social sciences would argue that, hey, we've been doing this forever. This is literally a job. Yes, we are just borrowing your ideas to integrate this into sort of the consumption production framework and build a consistent integrated framework for answering some of these questions. And turns out, thinking about demand side solutions has positive trade-offs across multiple SDGs. So this is a figure here. The way you read this is a higher number on this scale is more positive synergy between SDGs. And the lower number is there's more trade-offs. And you can see that all the supply side, all the demand side solutions have much higher synergies overall across the SDGs when compared to supply side solutions. So what do these demand side solutions look like? They can broadly be classified into 3 different categories. So they're the ASI categories, so avoid, shift, improve. So this thinking originated in the transportation sector in the 2010s, but now food, industrial production, mobility, housing, all of them have adopted such thinking. So what this shows here is the 2050 IEA projection for transportation emissions if you have only supply side solutions. And you could decrease your emissions by about 62% if one were to adopt these ASI strategies. So what this means in the context of transportation is avoiding transport if you can. So for example, if you had the option to telecommute, work from home, then that would count as avoiding transport. Shift is shifting your modes of transportation. So can you walk, bike, or use shared services instead of having a personal car to get around? And improve is the one perhaps we are most familiar with, which is improving the efficiency of service delivery. So this could be anywhere from shifting to EVs to give you that efficiency boost, or just having lighter cars so that you can gain on your fuel economy. So all of these put together have a potential of about 60%, and the number is pretty consistent regardless of which sector you look at. Now, the big question is, what type of policy infrastructure, what sort of incentives would people or governments need to enable such solutions? So how do you design policies that people adopt more EVs or more heat pumps, ACs, given that, for example, SUV sales are going to the roof already, right? So the market is literally coming back with a vengeance. So I'm not even making this up. So this is the latest vengeance model, which can give you body armor, pepper spray, bullet resistance armor. You got a V8 Cadillac engine, horsepower of a tank. So this is what is being sold in the market right now. And this is what we are trying to aim for, right? So sadly, that is the state of what we are up against. And a common criticism is that if you decrease your emission demand, your emission or material demand is going to take a hit on your quality of life. And that's not true. So the recent IPCC report showed that for mobility, these are for 2 different countries, looking at the passenger kilometers per day travel for the top 10% of the income distribution and the bottom 10%. And the decent living standard is the minimum requirement that one would have to meet to have a decent quality of life. And we already see that the richest people have their quota met. It's only the bottom deciles which have a gap to the decent living standard. So now going back to where we saw that there's a demand for these new materials and new EVs, now we can sort of make the connection and see where that demand is coming from, right? So all this excess demand, how do we deal with that? So the first question is, well, how much consumption is reasonable? So the decent living standard sort of set a floor for what is considered decent, livable. But if we want people to really thrive, where do we draw the line? And the next question is, well, how do we measure access to services? So a lot of these metrics are top down. So these are aggregated metrics. So how do we assess access for each single household or individual? We do not have the quality of data to ask and measure such questions, right? So piecing all of the three questions we see so far. So I'll talk about how we are thinking about these in some of our research projects. So how do we measure access to services? How much consumption is reasonable? And what sort of policy instruments can we design to enable adoption of demand side solutions? So those are the three projects that I'll be talking about. So the first one is higher consumption associated with higher well-being? So this is a question that's plagued humanity for probably thousands of years. And we'll take another crack at it today to see if we learn something new. So here we're borrowing from the social psychology literature on how well-being is characterized from a subjective point of view. So you have broadly three different measures. So you have the hedonic measures, which are your everyday fleeting reactions. Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you stressed? And then you have life satisfaction, which is where you evaluate your life on a scale of 1 to 10, everything put together. And this is the one that usually shows up in news reports with the Scandinavian countries being the happiest. So this is what they're usually measuring. And eudaimonic are deeper questions about life goals and purposes. And the relative importance of all of these are very culture specific. But the thing sort of that really started a big excitement in this field is this Kahneman paper in 2010, where they show that the ladder, which is the evaluative question, generally increases with income. So the more money you make, the more satisfied you're likely to be. But what they found interesting is that the emotional well-being, which is the not blue, and the positive ones plateaued at around 75,000. And this became the headline figure saying that, hey, you don't have to make more than 75,000. If you make more than 75,000, there's not much return that you're going to get on your well-being. And they also saw that stress maybe slightly increases once you make more money. And turn to a few years later, there's another paper also looking at the relationship between life evaluation and income. The earlier study was US-based, and this is for the world throughout. And they found these interesting, what they called turning points. So at around $100,000, you see that you actually don't just have plateauing, but you actually have decreasing life evaluation. So both of these results were sort of contradicting each other. And then we came in with a larger data set, and we wanted to understand what is it that money is really giving you. And we specifically focused on life satisfaction and stress and looked at the relationship between those with income. For life satisfaction, we found that it generally increases. We couldn't find any satiation or any plateauing in these trends. But for stress, we found very interestingly this turning point after which stress sort of bounces back in your life. Again, this is around 70,000 USD. So we wanted to understand the lifestyle factors that might be leading to this increase in stress. What is it that is causing this? And we found something very interesting. So we looked at three different examples of lifestyles. So first we compared unhealthy and healthy. So what you see here is that healthy individuals generally have much lower stress than unhealthy ones, which is sort of intuitive. But then for the healthy ones, you see that there's an increase in stress, which is much bigger than the unhealthy ones. Similarly, for those whose needs have been met, basic needs, food, clothing, shelter, for those, again, stress generally increases as you make money. And the worst of all is with employment, for those working full-time, more than 30 hours, you see that there is no turning point at all. Stress just increases as you make more money. So this is very paradoxical to us in that a lot of the life conditions where you think are generally good for you, being healthy, having your needs met, having a full-time job, actually leads to an increase in stress as you make more money. So again, this is sort of telling us that maybe you don't need to make so much money, but we have some hypothesis for what is going on. Why do we see this increase in stress, right? So our hypothesis was that generally you have one component of stress that decreases as you make more money. So these are things associated with bad health, not having your needs met. The more money you make, that stress decreases. But there's another component of stress that increases as you make more money. And that is why you find a turning point. And is this stress good for you? I think that's something we are investigating right now, because there's an existing theory of flow, which says that when the demands of the job meet the skills you have, you are in this flow state where you feel the pressure, but you deliver. So this could be you before a deadline, or Lionel Messi taking a penalty kick, and they thrive in such pressure, right? So it could be that, but then if this goes up or down, you'll end up with anxiety or boredom. So these are some questions that we are evaluating right now. Okay, so that was income, and income is really just a proxy for your consumption needs, right? It doesn't really tell you what are you buying with the money you make. So that's where we started shifting our focus towards expenditure. So right now it's the same relationship that we saw earlier with life satisfaction, but instead of income, now we have expenditure. So again, we sort of see this plateauing trend. And what we were interested was the happiest people who are spending the most. What are they spending on? And we focused on this little set of people here, so the highest life satisfied people, and started looking at their energy consumption and what sort of lifestyles that they have. So we did a little bit of latent class analysis to cluster out different lifestyle patterns for the happiest or satisfied people. And what we see is that there's a big range in the energy consumption, even within the happiest people. So you could have anywhere from 16 to 6 megawatt per hour capita consumption per year, showing that there is potentially a case to be made for a 60% decrease in your energy consumption, but still being the most satisfied, right? So that would be this blue lifestyle. And what we did was, on top of this, we superimposed with some of our collaborators in Spain who had access to EU data. So we made a similar trend for that. And you can see that the EU curve is way above the US curve for the same amount of expenditure. So for the same amount of expenditure, you're getting much higher return, if you will, on your life satisfaction. And similarly, we compared what are the consumption patterns for the highly satisfied in the US and EU. And even if you just isolated the lowest consuming lifestyle in the US and compared that with something in Spain, you could see that you could bring down your consumption even more if you move to Spain. So this is still an ongoing work, in that this is how we are trying to establish what the maximum thresholds should be in order to have a good quality of life. So we're still building on this. So we want to focus on smaller areas, because some of these are conflated with weather patterns, because if you're living in a colder climate, you spend more on energy. So those are some things that we are trying to figure out right now. All right, so that sort of brings me to the final study, which is about navigating efficiency, emissions, and equity trade-offs in some of these demand-side solutions, right? Because if I was in benevolent dictators, I would give heat pumps for everybody, EVs to everybody. But turns out most government policies have a fixed budget, and they have to make decisions about who gets certain subsidies. How do you design these subsidies that people who need it the most get it? But then how do you define who needs it the most, right? So there's some of these underlying philosophical questions that translate into policy as well. So for this, we looked at heat pump subsidies, as I was mentioning. So you have a fixed budget. So this is was inspired by the IRA in the US, the Inflation Reduction Act, which put out a basket of money for heat pump subsidies, but they were not clear on the definition of who qualified. And then we came in with our interpretation of what equity meant in this case. So I'll walk you through the different scenarios that we looked at. So we started at homeowners who did not have a heat pump, and we wanted to give everybody a minimum efficiency heat pump. And the results are robust to the technology of the heat pump, so don't have to worry about that. And we have a baseline scenario where things go on as usual, no subsidies. And then we have a simple payback model to see who's going to adopt. And broadly speaking, we have 3 themes for our subsidies. So we have an environmental theme where we give out subsidies to maximize emissions reductions. So heat pump is similar to an AC, but you could do both heating and cooling with a heat pump. And heat pump, it is an electrical device. It has more efficiency than a gas furnace. So it's about 3 to 4 times more efficient. So you have savings coming from a more efficient equipment, right? And then you're also not burning any natural gas on site in your houses. So if you want to maximize your emissions reductions, you could distribute your subsidies that way. And within the equity scenarios, we looked at 4 different cases. So we looked at 2 of these, which are income-based. So if you are below the poverty threshold, or if you are below a median income, you qualify for a subsidy. And then we looked at what we call a distributional weighting scenario, where, again, this is a recommendation by the previous administration in the US, where you could weight income by an exponent so that money is diverted to them more preferentially. The idea being that $1 is more valuable to a poor household than a rich household. And you can tweak the exponent to more aggressively target low-income households. And then finally, we also looked at expenditure burdens, because a lot of these are income-based and they don't really tell you how much people are spending towards their energy needs, right? So we looked at what fraction of household money was going towards their energy needs. And then finally, we looked at an efficiency scenario, which is to maximize the total social welfare from this policy. So we looked at the private benefits that one would get from the savings with a new heat pump, or also social benefits coming from emissions reductions. So this is sort of going back to the social costs of carbon and how that comes into an optimization scenario, right? So we ran all of these scenarios to see who's getting money in which scenario and how bad are the trade-offs. So here is how we thought about trade-offs. So we looked at average expenditure burden, which is an equity angle of looking at things. And then we looked at private benefits that households are getting across these different scenarios. And what we saw was, one, a clear trade-off in that the more aggressively you target equity in your policies, you lose out on the private benefits or the efficiencies, right? So that is this trend here. And then if you're to maximize emissions, regardless of what the private benefit or the equity is, you end up in this corner. So we sort of see this triangle of trade-offs between the equity you get on these things versus the private benefits versus the environmental benefits, right? So this is sort of the classic trilemma of a lot of sustainability questions, and that's reflected with this heat pump scenario as well. And the final piece is, where does the money go? Because this can also become political in that, depending on how you choose your equity instrument, money could get directed to different states in this case. So if you focused only on emissions, a lot of the money, for example, would go to New York, Kentucky, Missouri. And then if you looked at different expenditure or income weighted, then you see that New York, for example, fluctuates quite a bit. Kentucky misses out completely if you focused on income. And similarly, even within just the equity scenarios, we see pretty big trade-offs, especially with New York, if you focus on this, and this. So all of this is generally to say that your choice of equity definition matters in a lot of these policy questions. And in a lot of these cases, dramatically, the allocation between states moves around. Yeah, that sort of brings me to the conclusion of the talk. So hopefully I've inspired, communicated you that demand side solutions are consistent with climate change mitigation and well-being, and interpreting material access using existing data sources a little challenging, but some of the ways I showed you of how we're doing this, and there are some trade-offs with policy and implementation as well. Broadly speaking, some of the things I didn't get to talk about, but we are interested in is engaging with the local context about these material challenges. So a lot of the data I've showed so far are national surveys. So we are trying to get into local communities and understanding the needs that are there. And second is understanding the economic impacts of decreased demand, because it's sort of counterintuitive to a lot of the engineering and economic principles. So how does one go about that? And finally, which is sort of a big part of my program, is designing material. So how do we use all of this knowledge and take it back to how we move around atoms in the lab? So those are some of the focus areas. I'd like to thank a bunch of collaborators all around the world, and EPA, who don't exist maybe anymore, but for previously funding this work. And I'll leave you with this picture of all things we are interested in, from the atoms all the way to the humans. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.